Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead. So thank you to everyone who is joining us live, and thank you to everyone who is tuning in. I am very happy to welcome as our guest today Langston Kahn, who is a New York City-based shamanic practitioner who specializes in radical human transformation, ancestral healing, and restoring an authentic relationship with our emotions. His practice is informed by somatic modalities, contemporary shamanic traditions, and initiations into traditions of the African diaspora. He gives workshops and lectures internationally in person and online, and he has completed 9 years of training with Christina Pratt in the cycle of transformation and was one of the first people in 30 years to be selected to be a senior teacher and carry forth the lineage. He has served for 5 years on the Leadership Council of the Last Mask community, and his first book, coming out this week, is Deep Liberation, Shamanic Tools for Reclaiming Wholeness in a Culture of Trauma. I was privileged to first meet Langston in person as part of a workshop that he co-led with Gordon White back in 2019 called The Metaphysics of Desire. And that was a really fantastic workshop to be a part of. And I'm very pleased and so happy to welcome Langston as our guest today. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here.
So this podcast is focused on the arts of divination a lot of times, but that is really all about ways in which we come to meaning and understanding in our lives. And so I want to kind of start the conversation by asking you about your shamanic work and kind of how you came to that and what your journey was into that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I feel like whenever I'm asked that, part of me goes back to like experiences I'm having like when I'm a very young child and then experiences much later, because I see this through line. But I was one of those kids that was, you'd always find like talking to invisible people, you know, just like my parents would be like, who are you talking to? I'd be like, a lady. Like, what does she say? She says hi, you know, and just start telling them all about this lady. And then as I got older, as I think many of us do, I sort of lost a bit of my connection with that capability and capacity, or I shut it down a bit to just survive in contemporary settler colonialist culture, you know, materialist culture. And what happened was I really preserved my belief in magic and my sort of understanding that that was like a valid reality and experience through fantasy books, really, and sci-fi and stuff like that, like escaping into that kind of literature. But as I got older, I found my way into witchcraft. There was this women's wisdom circle at my Unitarian church I was part of, and they would lead these beautiful Yule rituals. And there was also instead of at Unitarian churches, you get to choose your Sunday school. So I chose this class that was honoring our Mother Earth. And we were, you know, chanting these earth honoring songs. We were like pulling medicine cards to find out animals that walked with us. And all that kind of stuff was like this, I think, just sort of priming the pump, so to speak, reminding me of this thread that had been in my life for a while. And, you know, fast forward a bunch of years, I ended up joining a Wiccan coven later in life, a very traditional Gardnerian Wiccan coven. And I think because it was so strict and formal, I'm a double Pisces, and I'm often like, you know, a watery pool of dreams and things, you know. And so with that strict, rigorous structure and regular, consistent meeting, combined with a lot of emotional work I was doing at the time to deal with deep, you know, chronic emotional and health issues I had, I think the spirit world just felt like, oh, he's actually finally listening. It's time to do some stuff. And I started having all these initiatory experiences, or people on the street would hand me these random objects that were very significant to me, or like I would be in certain like spiritual circles and indigenous traditions, and the medicine teacher of that tradition would like hand me something that I needed at that time, or tell me about these spirits that were with me. And I just got these messages that kept repeating and getting louder and louder, and these dreams I started having. And that led me to receive my first healing sessions with some shamanic practitioners. And ultimately, in following the path of that kind of initiation of my own healing, of just the areas where I felt really broken and disconnected from the fundamental basis of my being and who I was and my desire and my passion and ability just to, be authentic in the world and healthy, I began more and more to remember that way that was very natural for me as a child of being in the world, of having, spirit companions I was talking to frequently and co-creating within my life, and of um, just opening up to this conversation that I think is the most natural thing in the world, that's wanting to happen in all of us all the time, but that I've been so divorced from just because of our culture. And the more I open up to that conversation and follow the path of my healing, the more I really deeply settled into my body and stopped patterns of dissociation I had at the time, the more I realized that my path involved what you might call a shamanic path, a path of really working at this invisible layer of reality that contains all the aspects of our world that affect us but are invisible to us, including, spiritual, emotional, psychological, mythical, archetypal, and dream worlds, and working there to affect change in the physical world and tend balance there. And so I ended up joining a 5-year training program, essentially continuing to seek the path of my own healing. I had no intention of being a shamanic practitioner. I just wanted to learn, how do I become an adult? Because I see how most adults in my life aren't really showing up as adults in the way that I would want them to as a younger person, that most adults seem to be pretty lost themselves and not having the medicine for the poison that younger people are experiencing in the world. And so I joined this community to learn, how do I become that adult that I want to have in my own life? And over the course of following the path of that journey, which involved a lot of like deep shadow work and deep spirit work, deep ritual, deep engagement with the elements, and deep ancestral lineage repair, as I followed that path, along the way, I realized more and more that healing work was a good vehicle for the expression of my unique genius, that there was more and more people coming to me. That had actually always happened throughout my life, but earlier in my life, I didn't really have tools beyond just listening. And so as I followed that path of my own healing, I started guiding others where I could along the path that I had followed. And that eventually turned into my healing practice, as my spirits are pushing me more and more to step out in the world and do that.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful path that you followed that guidance and went along that route. And I'm certainly very glad that you did. I think it's just wonderful. And I think that going through that and talking about becoming a shamanic practitioner, you make the point in your book early on, I think, that you have very consciously chosen to use the word, shaman, shamanic practitioner, as opposed to animist or, other words that could be used, and that there is a very significant value in that word and what that word represents as a role. Could you kind of talk a little bit about what that role means and why you think that word is so important?
Yeah. It's a difficult word because there's so much pain there. There's so many ways contemporary Western peoples have abused that word and really harmed the indigenous peoples that word comes from. That, for example, the, Tungus speaking Evenki people, where we think, that word sort of originates from. And I guess I think it's useful to understand it's a little brief history of that word and its use to understand why I use it or why some people don't use it. So beginning in the 20th century, many Westerners begin using the word shaman to describe not only the specialists that I'm talking about, these specialists of moving into the invisible world and affecting our physical reality at this deeper level and tending balance between the individual and the family, and the individual themselves, and the family and the community, and the community and the spirit world, and began just applying it to everything inaccurately, like, medicine men, sorcerers, magicians, witch doctors, anyone who appeared to be working with spirits. And we still see a lot of that sort of messiness today around the definition. But where that widespread use of the word comes from as a term to apply cross-culturally to people with a very specific role in that culture is Mircea Eliade, who was this, Romanian religious scholar and academic that wrote this book, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. And that was really where the word got popularized in a sense. And, it's a problematic book in a lot of ways because he didn't meet shamans or live in indigenous culture where shamans practiced or observed the ceremonies. He really went off of anthropological accounts. But what he did was he was willing to risk and sacrifice, really, a huge part of his academic capital that he had earned over time through his career to argue to the Western world that people who are in this role that he called the shaman are not crazy people or hucksters, as they often were portrayed by anthropologists, but actually hold vital wisdom and knowledge and a legacy of humanity that we need to pay attention to. And so then we get people like Carlos Castaneda later, who pushes forward that a little even further by saying that one cannot understand shamanic worldview without becoming a shaman. And he questions objectivist field work, and he begins focusing a lot on hallucinogens as well, and popularizes some of that kind of work in relation to shamanism. And there's all sorts of problems with Castaneda as well, and all sorts of ways he was fraudulent and gave misinformation. But that was what he contributed in my view. This saying we can't just be anthropological about this, and we can't just be objective observers. We have to actually experience these things. And then you get someone like Michael Harner, who in the 1970s, writes, I think in 1980, he wrote The Way of the Shaman, but in the 70s, he started teaching after he studied among a lot of different indigenous peoples that Mircea Eliade would have called shamans. And he took certain spiritual technologies and stripped them of their cultural context and made them very palatable and useful by Westerners, which in some ways is great because it's giving Westerners these tools that they haven't had access to, that are these technologies of, reunion and coming back into that conversation that's always wanting to happen through us with life. But on the other hand, it's appropriation. And it's my belief that we can't effectively engage shamanic technologies without cosmology. And so stripping these tools of their cultural specificity and cosmology, we end up just engaging them to be better at capitalism, engage them to be better at the problematic world we've already created, versus allowing these tools to really stretch us so we become the people who can use them more in alignment with the way the first peoples use these tools. And that's what I'm interested in more in my practice. So that's a long-winded wet history, or maybe a very brief history of a long period of time. But to get back to why I use the word, animism is actually also, it's an academic word, just like, shamanism when used cross-culturally is. And animism was often used in the text it was originally used in as synonymous with primitive, synonymous with backwards. And it also, not all animist cultures are shamanic cultures, because not all cultures necessarily have someone that's in this role of the shaman that's tending that specific balance. Like a shaman is not necessarily the same as a diviner or a ritualist or, all sorts of different specialists that we have in different cultures. And so I think what the story and the word of the shaman does is it brings back that human link, that person who bridges the human and the spirit world and helps us to come back into relationship with the animist world, versus just understanding that there's spirits and everything, but having no way to deeply connect and engage that relationship.
Mm-hmm. And I think that goes back to what you were just saying about it. You can't divorce it from cosmology, so you can't divorce it from context and where it's located, but at the same time, the role remains in a sense the same, even if the cosmologies and many other parts of it are changing. That need for that is still deeper underneath the surface for all of humanity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really beautiful description of that. And thank you for kind of guiding us through that, what is essentially a very complex history. And I think you made that very easy to understand for people. There's another complex word that I wanted to see if you could unpack that you mentioned at the beginning of your book. And I think it's an important thread for how you then go on to unpack and speak about the soul's journey and how these techniques of coming to wholeness work with the soul's journey, hopefully. And that word is the dreaming. And that's another word from another culture. But I think that you have a beautiful description of it in your book. And I was wondering if you could just kind of talk to people about what that word means and how you see that in relationship to the role of a shaman.
Yeah. So, the dreaming is kind of a funny word. It's, in a sense, it's almost like a mistranslation by anthropologists of an Aboriginal concept that then ultimately Aboriginal people said, well, actually, you can use this word. It's not perfect, it's not precise, but it's one tool we can use to sort of export this idea into the contemporary, non-Aboriginal world. And so what it means, and words are always going to fail this concept somewhat, but some of the ways what I mean when I'm talking about the dreaming, I'll say that at least. One, it's a cosmological creation story of the universe. It explains how everything got here, and why everything is the way it is. And also, like any good cosmology, should give us a sense of like what we're doing here, like what is the meaning and purpose of our role here in life. And so that's all contained within the dreaming. With extending from that, in the way that there's no divide necessarily between the spiritual and the physical in shamanic cultures, it's also a blueprint for all of life. It explains through story how the land was shaped and created and the relationships between different aspects of the elements and animals and plants and humans have to each other. So it's like this weaving of this web of relationship through story. And then it's also a set of rules or laws that encompasses social relationships, economics, religious activities, and art that defines the idea of living in right relationship, living in a way that supports life versus anti-life, culture, versus the suicidal culture we live in for the most part right now. And so the other part of the dreaming is a landscape itself. In that same way that I said that the spirit world and the land are not two separate things, it's like the dreaming is always happening all around us. It has always been happening. It's not like it's the story of what once happened. It's the story of what happened at the beginning of time and still is happening beneath the surface of things. And so when I talk about the dreaming, often I'm using it to talk about that aspect of it, this dimension of reality beneath the surface of things that everything we perceive is an expression of.
Yes, and then the soul's journey basically is that we are coming into this dreaming. We are a part of that dreaming to fulfill a certain purpose that we were called here to be a part of.
And that comes more out of the cosmology of my shamanic tradition, which is a contemporary tradition, which has to do with this idea that everything is dreaming. Everything in the world is dreaming, and we're all just in one big dream. And so there's the dream that our ancestors maybe even started as a prayer, that they were praying for something and they prayed so long and so hard for that thing that it became a dream. They started dreaming about it, and eventually they held that dream so purely in their heart, and they held that dream as a community that maybe certain souls came to embody that dream, to be an answer to that dream in the world. And we are that dream of our ancestors in a sense. And so obviously now the ideas of community are much more diffuse. The ideas of ancestors are much more diffuse. Death isn't necessarily tended so well, but I still appreciate this idea that we are in this lineage of dreaming that's happening all around us, the dreaming of the earth, the dreaming of the elements, the dreaming of our ancestors. And within that, we have a dream that we are, a dream that we fell so in love with, we decided to come to this earth and embody it. And that dream, you might say, is our purpose, which I define not as a vehicle, not as like to be a teacher, or to be a diviner, but it's an energy that you can never fully put into words. The only way you can answer the question of what is my purpose fully is by living a life and dying. Then or hopefully by the end of that life. And so it's this like indescribable energy that we can constantly work to orient to and get better and better at more precisely and sustainably finding vehicles for the expression of in the world. But the energy itself is never going to be contained just to one vehicle. It's something that's never been seen before and never will be seen again. It's like specific to this lifetime. It's the unique medicine that we came here to be. So when I'm talking about my personal dreaming, that's what I'm talking about. That way that I'm working with my heart to co-create that energy that I am in the world and bring it into manifestation.
Yes, I think it's really important what you bring up, that it is much larger than any one role in our lives, because I think that's one way that we've gotten trapped as a culture is, people searching for purpose or meaning in a single thing, or trying to define themselves by one aspect of themselves, and that is just too small, really, to contain the multitudes that we are.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
So with that in mind, then the another, I think, really foundational thing that we need to discuss, at least to get to the beginning of your book, is the concept of triggers and what triggering is and how that relates to what we are learning here and how we are, living our dreaming or getting turned aside from it in some ways.
Yeah. So from the perspective, at least of my shamanic cosmology, life is always trying to initiate us. Life is always working to bring us into a deeper ability to transmit that dream that we are in the world, and to remember that vastness and mystery of who we are and bring it more and more into expression and embodiment. And because if you understand all of life as this big organism, like all of the earth is this one big organism that's working to move into health and wholeness and going somewhere, who knows where. Each of us then, humanity itself then, is meant to be a part of that organism that's essential and vital and in service to the whole of that organism, just like our heart is in service to the whole of who we are, or our liver, our spleen. Humans have their own unique role, just like any organ in the body. And each individual human within that has our own unique role, which is our purpose. So life wants us to be doing that unique, weird thing that only we can do. But what often happens is, as we're coming out and being our bold, beautiful, authentic, messy self, when we're younger, especially in cultures where parents don't have a lot of support and children aren't initiated into adulthood, there's lots of little moments along the way where we're just expressing our beauty and our authenticity, and we get shut down in some way. And we have an experience where we feel fear, and we feel like if I don't make a choice that's out of alignment with my authenticity and my true nature, I'm going to die. Like I'm just coming home. I'm like, let's say I'm like in fifth grade, I'm 10 years old, and I just really felt something about me and my meanness. And I just start dancing, doing this like crazy dance. That's just my dance, just feeling that meanness flowing through me. And I come in the door doing this crazy dance, and I accidentally knock into my parent who's just come home from work. They've had a really hard day, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to make enough money for us to have food to eat the next day. And they say, "Well, you get out of my way. Will you stop doing that? Like, stop being so annoying." That can feel terrifying in that moment. And there's so many more extreme examples of ways that happens, and different types of abuse that occur and all sorts of things. But I emphasize these small little moments because I think they're what's often get overlooked. These small moments when we feel as a child, maybe if I keep doing this thing, I won't be loved. And for a child, if I'm not going to be loved, maybe I won't be fed tomorrow. So it's really this life or death thing when we're children and actually dependent on our parents. And so we frequently make these choices out of fear to survive that are perfectly good choices for that moment because they allow us to survive, if we're still here. But then that part of us that made that choice can get trapped, making that same choice out of fear again and again and again. And so what happens is when we encounter similar experiences to that situation, we get triggered. We amp up out of proportion to what's actually happening, or we shut down and we project onto the present moment what happened to us in the past versus seeing clearly the actual dynamic in the present moment. And so that's how I would define a trigger, that amping up or shutting down, or that perseverating and thinking about something that happened long after the fact, feeling like we weren't able to show up in the way we wanted to in a certain moment. All these are, or just feeling much younger than our current age. All these are signs that we've been triggered. And so I see triggers as, in a sense, not just these unhappy accidents, but life as a teacher trying to show us a part of ourselves trapped in one of these moments of fear from the past. And in that moment, we have an invitation to go be with that part of ourselves trapped in that moment and learn how to show up for them in a way that allows us to reclaim the energy from that moment and the power that's locked away there and our uniqueness that's locked away there, and let die those old survival mechanisms that are no longer appropriate for the current realities of our life.
So I think then one of the important things, we're going to talk about embodiment and kind of how you speak about that, but it's taking those moments when you're triggered and looking at them as lessons, at starting to observe and notice them and be aware of them. I think you call it's like tripping over stones, I think.
Yeah.
And I love that imagery because it's something that then brings it up in a way that these are not just like grand, they're not necessarily, they can be very emotionally charged moments, but they can also be smaller and less, grandiose moments. But it can be something where you can start to check in and notice with yourself, oh, hey, that seemed a little odd. That seemed a little out of balance with what it was really called for. And the more you're aware of those little stones that you trip over, it doesn't have to necessarily be the giant boulders that you trip over if you've consistently missed the small stones you've been tripping over in that. Can you talk a little bit about that stone thing? Because I really loved that imagery.
Yeah. So one of the processes described in the book is about how we can work with life as a teacher to sort of pick up the stones we trip over and then flip them and track the external dynamic that feels like it's triggering us to where we carry it in our internal landscape, where we can actually create change there and re-empower ourselves. And this isn't any kind of like victim blaming. This isn't about saying like, you're just responsible for your own life and you're always manifesting, so it's your fault that your life sucks. It's not about blame in that way. It's more about, I think of it as liberation and empowerment. This idea that even if like for me, as a Black queer person in the US, there's going to be probably plenty of times when a person says something triggering to me. And in that moment, I could be like, oh, the world sucks. There's crazy racists out there. And that's true. The world does suck and there's lots of crazy racists out there. And if in that moment I can track the external dynamic that triggered me back into myself and then show up for myself there, then I can reclaim my power in that moment and then act in accordance with my beliefs and principles when something like that happens versus being triggered. And I want to be really emphasize here, I'm not saying we should never have a big emotional response. Quite the opposite. I think the goal of this work is to be able to respond fully to life in the moment with the full range of emotions that we have, versus that feeling of trigger where you feel stuck or unsure, or you feel like ashamed of what you just said, or you're not sure how you reacted, or you're still thinking about it after the event. Like when we're really in our authentic emotional response, it's this feeling of something rising up, being expressed, being released, and the next emotion coming, and not feeling stuck and mired and wrestling with this thing. And so, yeah, in the beauty of the practice, I think, is that it's very fractal, in that you don't have to, like you said, you can start out small with just what are the small little things that you're noticing are tripping you up throughout your day. And as you continue to grow in that practice, the practice can grow with you. And so you start out sort of like picking off these leaves of a tree, and then you end up shaking branches, and then finally you can uproot whole trees, in the sort of orchard of your soul that have been getting in the way of you being who you want to be in each moment.
And I think that what you're speaking of there also comes back to sort of paying attention to your felt sense as opposed to just what our minds conceive of or make lists of what issues we have, because it's very easy. I mean, I find I do this myself of like, I will now analyze the things that have upset me, and I will, in my head come up with logical reasons why it happened or even where it might have come from. But that kind of like just being in the head about it is not the full process. And you talk about the need to be in your body with these things and to come at it from like the felt sense. Can you talk a little bit about felt sense and how that is different from our Cartesian idea of like things in the mind? Is how we'll fix things.
Absolutely. Yeah. So for me, the felt sense is that knowing beyond words that we carry in our body of any given situation or experience we're having. There's this way that I think in our culture we so heavily prioritize the mind. Like you were saying, there's that Cartesian duality, I think, therefore I am. But even more than just that, there's a way of, even when we're aware of the heart and our emotions, we somehow denigrate them as being less valid than the rational mind. Like that's the real objective, pure truth. When in my experience, when people are operating solely in their mind and denying their emotions, that's usually when they're acting most out of integrity, frequently, in terms of bulldozing their own boundaries, bulldozing over others' boundaries, just not, because we need that deep knowing in the body and the wisdom of our heart and our emotions and that sort of more right brain logic to be able to actually effectively show up, in my view, as a spiritual adult in everyday life. And I guess how I think about that is it's not, I'm not saying that we should divorce ourselves from the mind, but it's more tapping back into this deeper mind, this ability of the mind not to analyze and judge and compartmentalize and decide what matters and what doesn't matter. Those are all great capabilities sometimes, but in the realm of the emotions, we need to have a mind that can let the heart lead it versus trying to control and manage the heart. And so what that often feels like is this knowing that our body communicates to us through the symbol, which I think is really useful for, especially in the realm of things like divination, to have a connection with this knowing in the body. Because ultimately, in my experience, if you can learn to interpret the symbolic language of your body, you can interpret most divination systems. Because it's I mean, obviously you need to learn this unique symbol set of any divination system, but ultimately, the symbolic language that our body uses to communicate to us is the same symbolic language the spirit world uses to communicate to us, in my experience. And so what does that mean when I say symbol? What it means is it could be a feeling, like a physical sensation, like there's this clenching in my gut that I'm feeling when I feel into this question or the situation. It could be an image, like there's this image I see of this woman that looks very angry, who's looking in this mirror, looking so angry. Okay. And then it could be this emotional quality, this sudden sadness is coming, just tears streaming from my eyes. I'm not sure why when you say that word. Or it could be a memory that comes, like suddenly remembering this experience I had when I was in first grade and we got to play in the sprinklers. I don't know why, but just coming to me. And if we're able to not try to instantly analyze it and say why that is and make it make sense and like track it back in a very Freudian way, if we're able to sit with it and let it speak to us on its own terms and describe it as best we can without trying to label it, almost like feeling in the dark, being willing to move into the places where we feel inarticulate, that's when our inner experience begins to unfold to us and our symbolic language begins to make itself clear, in my experience.
Yeah, you speak about, like, you're talking about letting go of that analyzing side of our minds. Not that there's that it doesn't have its role or doesn't have its place. Even as you're saying with divination, you need to be familiar with the symbolic language of, let's say, a tool that you're going to use. But then you need to be able to drop down and be more in an intuitive, felt sense with that tool. You have to be able to let go of just the analyzing side of it. Otherwise, you're not going to be getting a good portion of the information that maybe the spirit world is trying to communicate through to you using that symbol set. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think you speak a little bit, it's like a sort of a soft gaze when we're looking at these things. And there's a beautiful story you have about, like, the feeling that we want to have when we're trying to approach these things. Or I would say even with divination, the same idea of having a soft gaze, and the same way that you would try to coax a deer to come towards you. And that in the book, when you described it, it's like everyone knows that feeling. Like if you were in a forest glen and you were trying to behave in such a way that a deer would come towards you instead of scaring it away, that way that your body would feel and the way that you would drop into that is very different from, like, I will now go and find a deer and I will, make it behave and become my friend. That would instantly, the deer would be gone. And it's that same way with trying to come to truth or knowledge. You have to have a soft gaze with it.
Yeah, you really, I mean, that is one of the metaphors I like to use a lot because, like you said, it's so visceral and easy to access for people. But there's this way that idea of the rational, objective scientist who's going to dissect something to understand it just doesn't work when we move into our inner experience. Or the idea of, like, the incredibly insightful analyst who will just listen to what you have to say and then tell you what it all means. That also doesn't quite work. That we need to be willing to be in the uncertainty. And the best way to do that is to be genuinely compassionate and curious with what's arising in our inner experience. And that's surprisingly harder than you would think, because most of us aren't trained in that habit. We're trained to have the answer right away, to perform, to be able to give voice to what we need to say in the moment quickly so that we won't be seen as stupid or slow. And it's this whole, like, product, I think, of industrialization and the mechanization of so much of our life. And now even more so with the expected instant responses of the internet, and so I guess for me, what I think helps us most to be able to give voice, be able to allow our inner experience to unfold, is when we're not requiring it to do anything or trying to fix something or trying to understand something, but just genuinely being with. The same way if a friend was sobbing, and you walked into a room where you saw that happening, you wouldn't, like, rush in and say, stop crying. Or you might sit down, try to figure out what's going on. Do they want me to put my hand on their back? Okay, I'm going to just sit here for a moment. I'll see if they want to speak to him. I might ask them if there's anything you want to share with me, or if they just want me to sit here. That's how we want to be with our own experience, which for many of us is so instinctual with another human being. But when it comes to ourselves, we can't even comprehend doing that. And so, yeah, I think that metaphor of the deer, that experience of just how we would approach a deer, is really helpful, because our hearts themselves are these wild, shy animals that require our respect and care to really be willing to trust us a little bit, to open up to. Because oftentimes we've spent a lot of our lives betraying our hearts in different ways, in varying degrees, in the ways that our culture asks us to, in the ways that the constraints, demands of our life ask us to. And so I think it takes even extra compassion and patience and willingness to just sit with, pull up a chair and sit next to our heart when we're first starting a process like this, so that we can regain that trust that maybe has been lost in some choices we've made in the past with how we talk to ourselves.
Yeah, and you have some beautiful practices in the book, even in the early chapters for, when we're talking about this stuff, we're not going into the exact specifics of how you lay out some ideas. I mean, there's many ways to do it, but you have some ideas of how to drop down and then spend time kind of being with yourself and experiencing this felt sense in a bodily way. And I think there's a quote that I really liked. I'm going to quote something from your book. I hope you don't mind. But I really like it, and I think it fits with what you were just saying, which is, ironically, it is when we see something stuck inside of us exactly as it is, without trying to change it, that it often naturally begins to shift. I think that's really beautiful. And for me, that instantly struck a chord, because I think a lot of times with divination, this kind of ties into some questions I wanted to ask you later, but I think it's important because there's this stereotype of the idea that divination is all future-oriented and very action-oriented. But really, there's a lot of divination is about reaching that still point of just coming to an understanding of where you are before you seek to try to move forward. It's you have to have that place of stillness and that moment to let it just be for a moment, and then see how it shifts and see what the cards or yourself is laying out for you before you take that instant action that we all want to just move forward into something.
Yeah, I love that. I love that way of describing divination. I think, for me, one of my primary forms of divination, I use a lot of physical forms of divination, but also my primary form is the shamanic journey. Going to spirits in that trance state to receive guidance. And I think from that perspective, our helping spirits are not moral. They're not trying to tell us what we should do or shouldn't do, or what's right or wrong. But they want us to choose consciously. They want to help us to be able, like you said, to see beneath the surface of things to the true nature of the energies we're engaging with in the current state of our life and the current state of like the different stakeholders at play in our life, and then be able to make a conscious choice understanding those dimensions that are going on beneath the surface. And that's, in my experience, one of their primary goals with us, as these ecstatic co-creative partners. And so, yeah, I love that description of divination. It's just helping us to really see where we are currently in the present moment so we can choose, without rushing to get to that next action step before we really can feel where we are.
Mm-hmm. Very difficult to do sometimes.
Yeah.
Speaking of practices, I wanted to bring up and have you just talk a little bit about energy bodies, and because I think you have a chapter all about energy bodies and practices around that, and there are a number of issues around this. One of them being that a lot of people it's not even a conversation that is had as a culture. We're not taught to be aware of what our energy body is. Or maybe it's very vague in our minds. So that leads to some issues around that, and that kind of leads into boundary questions. But I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what your view of the energy body is.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So energy bodies. I mean, when I first heard that term, I kind of felt like unsure if I wanted to engage with it in any way. Like it felt very new agey, even as someone who was raised by a mother who loved that kind of sort of cosmology. But I think the important thing to understand with energy bodies is that they are not some abstract, strange, ethereal thing. Like, yes, they literally are the etheric body. And what I mean when I say that is our energy bodies are the logical conclusion of our thoughts and our actions and our choices that we're making all day, every day, throughout our day and throughout our life over time. They simply are our habits, the sort of energetic manifestation of our habits, the logical conclusion of the choices that we're making on a daily basis. That's how I would define the energy body. And so there are basic structures that all humans need, including like just to be in a state of health and well-being. And I would include in that, a strong sense of grounding, of connection to the earth. And when I say grounding, it's not some abstract concept. I'm talking about just like we need to ground electrical wiring, we are electric as humans. We're little electromagnetic energy bodies, and so we need to plug into the bigger energy body of the earth to be grounded, to not blow our fuses, to not have to constantly keep our energy very low out of fear of blowing our fuse, to be able to be in the bigness of all that we are and all that we're plugged into in terms of the different guides and helpers that we're working with. We need to have that grounding of the earth. And of course, to be connected to the earth, we also have to first be connected to our own bodies as well. So it's another aspect of grounding, not kind of like hovering slightly outside of them or keeping ourselves just in the mind, cut off from, the heart up or the waist up. We need to be in our full bodies and then through those bodies plugged into the earth. So that's one aspect of our energy body, which is our grounding. And then there's the sort of upper part of our central channel, which is that connection to the cosmos, that connection to the above, to which you might call the divine, to, in a Taoist cosmology, this sort of true yang energy of blessing and protection and generosity. And that's maybe a little more seeming abstract than the idea of being grounded and connected to the earth, but it wouldn't be seen as so abstract in an indigenous culture that understood, or any culture that understood, of the innate divinity of everyone in that culture and the importance of staying connected and tuned in to your own innate divinity and the part of you that connects to all things. That cosmic perspective that you might feel when you're looking up at the stars, seeing that radiant energy and feeling so small and so big at the same time. Like the need, it's understood in indigenous cultures that we need to stay connected to that dimension of who we are as part of just being an adult in the world, along with that grounding in the earth. A very, very Orphic mystery style, like I'm a child of earth and starry heaven kind of feeling. And so that's another part of our energy body, this sort of upper part of the central channel, and the lower part being our grounding cord. Sorry. Then the last part, the last two parts I would say is there's our boundaries, which is this kind of egg shape around our bodies that define our space. And a place that we have a certain level of sovereignty within. And so often, like when we're feeling angry or even rage-filled, it's a sign that sovereignty or our boundaries are being threatened in some way or have been crossed in some way. And that anger is showing us what we need to do to restore and repair those boundaries in the moment. And so those are like the three major components of the energy body. Then, of course, there's the inner landscape of our energetic system, which some people might map out as the chakras. There's lots of other, different maps and different cultural cosmologies. But that understanding of these energetic centers in our body that we can move into as an interface between our spirit, our mind, our emotions, and our physical body, and affect change their working in that inner dimension. And so that's what I mean when I'm talking about the energy body. And obviously that's very simplified. There's lots of beautifully complex, exquisite diagrams of energy bodies out there. But those are the aspects that I find are most needed to just be in a basic state of health and well-being as they move throughout the world. And the aspects that most often get missed in our quest for the complexity and the magic and the risk, and we kind of skip over often those very basic components.
Yes. Yeah, I think that is so very, very important. Your description of grounding and the exercise you give for that is really beautiful in the book, and I really enjoyed that section. You mentioned the grounding also as like, actually we are electromagnetic beings. My husband is a theremin player, and theremin is all about, of course, the electromagnetism of the human body. And it's very interesting to watch people's reactions when he speaks about that sometimes, because really people haven't thought about their bodies in that way. It seems very, very foreign as a concept. And it is so very easy to perceive if you're in front of an instrument like that can make it into sound. So it's a beautiful physicalizing of what you were talking about. It's
I
obviously
love that
on many
example.
levels, but
yeah, thank you for that. That's amazing.
But you also talk, I think in the book you mentioned that there is the possibility of being too grounded, people like possibly being a little bit too heavy into the earth. And that's not something I've seen discussed very often. Can you just kind of describe what you mean? Like if you were trying to describe to somebody what some of the qualities of being ungrounded would look like, or what the qualities of being possibly too grounded would kind of look like, what would that feel like, do you think?
So when I talk about that, it's not so much that I'm saying too grounded, but more an excess of grounding energy, so to speak, which sounds like the same thing as too grounded. But what I mean is, like, if you were actually grounded, then you're probably not going to be in excess so much. But so it's almost like the excess itself ungrounds you in a sense. But what I mean when I'm talking about excess grounding, it could be like, let's say you've been doing a lot of good personal work and you have been like digging up all this old stuff, so you're freeing up more and more energy and power, but you haven't actually moved that energy anywhere. You haven't actually taken any action. You start feeling this buildup of this, what you might call like an excess of yin energy, that you forget which way is up in, and it turns into a kind of depression. So that's one kind of excess grounding in a way. Another example is, let's just say like you're like, connecting in the earth, getting more and more in your body, more and more in your body. And you're not necessarily keeping that relationship with, again, what's wanting to move or express, or that connection to the above as well. And just going deeper and deeper, sinking down, you get this sort of into this like heavy, solid place that's a little too solid, a little too constricted or rigid, maybe. And sometimes this can show up also as like a need to mother everyone around you in your life, or like care for everyone in this specific way in your life, as a kind of excess grounding, like this like excess of this nurturance energy that naturally arises from the earth. And so there's a lot of different ways it can express individually in different ways, but it's that I think most of us have either experienced it ourselves or seen someone who's in this state of kind of excessive grounding before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So after that in the book, and I think this relates very much to our topics of divination and what truth is. You have the concept, I think you learned from Christina Pratt, of the truth chord. And that is not something that I was familiar with before reading your book. And I was wondering if you could just kind of briefly describe that. And then I kind of want to speak to some of the ways that you talk about working with that in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that is a technology that was created by Christina, and I find it very useful, and definitely for divination, but just for life in general, as this energetic structure that's connected to what you might call like the highest power of the universe, that energy of the above, the sky, that sort of archetypal place of the above, and then down into through our inspiration, that like capacity of our sense of truth that comes out of our relationship with vision, our intuition, that truth that comes out of our relationship with our heart, and that instinct that comes out of that sort of like gut place of our truth, like that primal yes or no, good, bad, like right or wrong, like, like there's that very binary feeling of either I'm drawn to this or this is super not for me, like that tug in our gut. And then through those three centers of knowing our truth, into the earth, anchored into the earth. So it's this way of cultivating a relationship with truth that connects your three personal centers of truth, which often can get hijacked when they're not connected to each other. Like it's easy for our inspiration to get hijacked, and we think we're following this deep vision, but like, for example, we're trying to create more social justice in the world. When we look back, we're creating a trail of injustice in our wake, or that's a sign our inspiration has become hijacked a bit, or our heart becomes hijacked and we think we're really following our heart's true purpose and desires, and we are maybe, but our heart's a bit hijacked, so we're moving more and more off our center. The instinct isn't as easy to get hijacked unless you've experienced certain types of trauma, especially sort of like sexual trauma or certain types of abuse that really cause us to not feel we can connect or trust that primal relationship, or have to absent ourselves from it a bit. But when those three wisdom centers are aligned, it just helps all of our truth to inform each other. And so we have a more three-dimensional sense of truth then. But then on top of that, connecting to the above and below connects our personal truth, this larger sense of these, what you might call like universal truths in a sense. So we can better be able to notice if something is then lighting up our truth chord or causing our truth chord to resonate and hum like a instrument string in the presence of it, regardless of if we like that source of truth, regardless if we like the truth itself, we get better able to really feel the presence of truth, even when it's not what we're wanting.
Yeah, and I think that even just the very word truth has become so loaded these days in our current world. So I think that
Yeah.
that testing of that inner compass is important, because all of us, and I think I wanted to ask you kind of what your opinion is, looking at how people are having such crazy diversions about the nature of truth in our world today. It's a very kind of open-ended question, but do you think that it's been getting worse, or do you think this is just the product of us, as a culture, so few people having those truth chords, that ability to connect all three of those centers together before we go and act on what we think is true in the world? Is there something fundamentally getting worse, or is it just this is a new expression of it? Large question.
Yeah, I think there is. I think I think in many ways things are getting worse, and other ways they're getting better. As always. But to specifically talk about the ways they're getting worse, I think partly because of a lack of grounding, people are rooting into, as their source of grounding, their devices, their phones, their computers, their social media networks. And these spaces are easily manipulated and are designed to create bubbles of other people that think just like you. So your truth gets more and more distorted over time, unless you're actively seeking to have a diverse, array of people that you're connecting with. And on top of that, there's a way that we're being overloaded and attacked by information, that there's information being pumped into us at all times. And the information is not neutral either. It has very specific agendas. And so I think for many people, overwhelmed by this sea of information that we're stuck in, they latch on to easy truths that affirm their own biases versus being interested in really navigating and exploring something, because it feels too overwhelming to do. There's too much out there and we're already absorbing too much. I don't have the capacity to read another article. Put that in the endless tabs of things to read, So I think that's one. I think it is getting worse. I think that's one reason. And I think another aspect of this also has to do with the fact that things are getting better. I think that, at least in the US, not to be too US centered, but in the US, that's where I can speak from because where I live, we're starting to wake up, or many people are starting to wake up more to the lies and delusions of white supremacy and colonialism and patriarchal power structures and different aspects of ways that we've been just fed very harmful lies that were explained to us as things that were inherently truthful, and it was irrational to question them. And I think there's also a reaction to that too. So people are sort of digging their heels in to these denials of those deeper truths that are starting to surface from those lies and delusions. And it's scary. I understand why, because it's scary to really think about the different aspects of rank, power, and privilege that many of us will have to sacrifice if we want to create a world that doesn't center those delusions. And so I think, yeah, of course, then people's relationship with truth is going to become more and more distorted as they have, as the colonial project has to invest more and more energy and money and resources into preventing people from seeing the truths that are extremely apparent about the basic personhood of people who are non-white. To just use one example. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that it's It's an interesting question because I think it also reflects back on tools of divination, because you can do the same thing in mini form. You can sort of isolate and maybe reflect in a way that is not connected to all three of those centers of truth on any tool that you're taking in, like the media stream that you're taking in, or the way that you're interpreting things that are happening to other people or yourself, just like the way that you interpret cards, or the way that you interact with truth seeking from these like spiritual, mystical things. You can also, if you're dedicated to it, you can ignore that advice, or twist it in some ways, and that comes back to those triggers or wounded parts of ourselves that can knock us off track, and unfortunately, maybe cause it to be harder for us to break those habits.
Absolutely, we can. And I think for me, because my primary divination system is journeying, I've had to learn a lot of skills for how to overcome my own tendency to bullshit myself, as we all, or many of us have. And so, like, for example, I find it really helpful to ask a question and receive the answer, and then ask, and I don't know how well this would work in a, I don't know that this always works with something like tarot, but I ask, like, what would I see if I wasn't afraid? And then journey again and ask that question. What would I see if I wasn't in denial? Show me what I would see if I wasn't full of shit, which has to do with like a combination of this fear and denial and lying to myself. That's another question. What would I see if I wasn't lying to myself? And then as we're doing that, also really keeping a record of our divination, of our journeys, and separating out the question we asked, the spread or whatever was shown to us in the after we asked the question, taking an action based on what we saw. And sometimes that action is to ask another question, or take something to our altar or something, but taking an action and then noticing how our life responds to that action and seeing if it's in alignment with our interpretation and our question. And if it's not, then going back and looking, were there too many assumptions in my question? Was my interpretation sideways? Was the action off based on the interpretation that I had? And really this is where being a good scientist is important in overcoming our own tendency to bullshit ourselves as human beings, and being rigorous, because I think the more we do that, the more we refine our signal clarity and our ability to interpret the symbolic language, like I was talking about before. And then in those moments when we have the risky, hairy question, it's harder to lie to ourselves in those moments, because we've done the work to know what it feels like when our truth chord is really humming and vibrating, in those moments.
Mm-hmm. And that would be an example then of like deep mind, as opposed to the analyzer, shall we say, because it's that deep mind that is courageous in that way and is also felt rather than just analyzed. But exactly. It does have the element of analysis, because you're paying attention to it and you're acting on it, and it's not just like a momentary thing.
Yeah, and to me, like, so much of shamanism is understanding it's all good. Like, all consciousness is wonderful. Mm-hmm. And when is which consciousness most useful? Mm-hmm. And so, like, when is the analysis need to come in, and when is it just getting in the way and sending us into doubt and collapsing our experience? And that's the
balancing act.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
That's
totally.
The trick. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, I just kind of, two things. One, someone has put, there are some questions in the Q&A, I believe, and I will get to that in a second. If there are other people who would like to ask questions, I just want to do a little brief reminder that you can use the Q&A button if you would like to. The other thing I wanted to ask is, you mentioned that your primary form of divination is journeying. When you do other forms of divination, what do those look like?
Yeah, so I read with many different tarot decks. One of them, and honestly, my primary deck is the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. I also my other main system is really reading with bones, a sort of sortilege system that's very connected to my ancestors and often involves some trance work while I'm doing it as well. Those are my two go-tos. I have other sort of more binary forms of divination that I practice. I read with the Lenormand as well. But that's really, those are my primary forms of divination. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When you were talking in the section of your book about boundaries, you talk about how negotiating healthy boundaries is sort of like a loving act of warriorship. And the way that you described that was extremely powerful for me. And one of the quotes that I really loved from that section was that you said, "Niceness is what we do when we don't have the courage to be honest."
Yeah. So that comes right out of the beliefs and principles of the last mass community, which is the shamanic community that I'm part of. And yeah, I come back to that again and again. It's so important because we live in a culture of niceness a lot, of which also has to do with that like truthiness of like the sense of like, yeah, it's not polite to be honest with someone. And I want to give a caveat to that I'm not talking about bludgeoning people with our truth. I'm not saying this is my truth, so I get to say whatever I want because it's my truth, like, or like just saying inappropriate things or saying harmful things because they're our truth. That's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about those moments when instead of saying what needs to be said in the moment in a way that the person can understand it and hear it, and that is an integrity to ourselves, we say something nice because we don't want to hurt someone's feelings. And in my experience, that can be a betrayal of ourselves in that moment and of the other person. Because what we're saying is, I don't trust that you have enough healing capacity to actually hear something that might cause you discomfort. Or I don't trust you have maturity to hear something that's discomfort, so I'm not going to risk going there. And so it is a barrier to intimacy. It's a barrier to vulnerability in ourselves and others. And often it leads to stagnation. And when you're willing to deliver that honesty, with right timing to the right person in a way that it can be received, those are all important things to consider when we're delivering truth. When you're willing to do that, it pierces stagnation and just invites forward movement in. Like, I don't know if you or other people listening have had a lot of experience with like different types of sort of leadership by council or committees or sort of communities that you've worked in. Yeah. And I know you have your coven. Yeah. So we all know what that feels like. And sometimes it takes a while to notice that feeling of stagnation, that feeling like the energy draining, the feeling like you leave and you're just exhausted versus that beautiful, wonderful, energized, excited feeling that we sometimes can have with other people. And often that's because there were moments of this niceness, moments when instead of risking saying what you really felt in that moment, you tried to be nice. Yeah. So that's what I mean when I say that.
Mm-hmm. For you, when you are working, when you are journeying for someone else, are there times when it is difficult for you to sort of, how do I put this, to manage the truth that you need to show to someone? If it is particularly difficult or challenging, like, does that ever come up where that honesty is difficult for you as a practitioner, or is it that your question. Development, like your relationship with your spirits is such that doesn't come up?
On one level, it doesn't come up that much because if someone's asked me for a journey, they're wanting the truth. They like the right timing is right there already. Like, they've asked for it, the spirits are delivering what they need to hear, and I'm just going to trust that the spirits know what needs to happen. And there's very specific questions I ask during the intake, not for me. Like, some people think that I'm asking intake questions because I want to get a feeling for that person, but it's actually, I could go in totally blind, and I have sometimes for clients when they want to do that. But it's more about understanding how that person currently sees their life, the context they have for their life, so I can deliver the truths that come in a way that's actually useful to them, given their current understanding of their life. And so sometimes how a spirit sees a person's life is very different from how they see their life, and so you need to be that bridge between those two understandings. And so, for example, with the case of sexual abuse, I am not going to tell someone you were sexually abused. That's inappropriate. That is, in my understanding, a crossing of a boundary for me to decide I know if someone was abused or not. Even if a spirit's sharing that with me, what I'll say is I'll describe the energetic experience that the spirit is showing to me as the spirit's describing it, but I will not then label it as sexual abuse if that person has not told me that they experienced sexual abuse. So, but if they do, then I'm perfectly fine with putting what I see in the context of that experience. So that's just one example, and that's an extreme example, but yeah, I don't filter a lot, but I do translate. I think like one of the best movies that's so similar to the experience of translating symbolic language in a shamanic healing session is Arrival. Where she's trying to figure out the language of the aliens, and share it with humans, and then of course understanding the language changes everything, and so that's very similar to, I think, the experience of a journey in some ways. Of oftentimes sometimes I'm in my symbolic language, and that's how the spirits are communicating to me. But often I'm actually moving into the symbolic language of the person I'm journeying on the behalf of, and so I just need to trust that what I'm sharing, as long as I have felt really clearly and felt that little part of my own truth chord click where I know, okay, I received all the information that was needed in this moment and I've transmitted it. Now I can move on. I don't necessarily need to know exactly what it means. I just need to be able to interpret the sort of feeling of it, if that makes sense, and what it means about what the person needs to do, essentially, or what ramifications it has on their life.
Yeah, that ties in perfectly, because my next question was going to be about that, the symbol set, and what that relationship is between it being the symbol set of the person that you're journeying for versus your own symbol set. Because I know for seer work, doing like, trance-based divination work that is not like shamanic journeying, not from, that tradition, but it is very much a combination in some way, but leaning more heavily to the symbol set of the person that has asked the question, because it is for them. So, but it has to still be understandable by the person so that you can help, interpret and bridge that divide.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, I think another dimension of that is just some of that I don't always notice what's my symbolic language and what's theirs until after I'm the journey, when they're like, oh, well, this is why this happened. I'm like, okay, glad I know that now. Like I remember there was this, like a little example, but there was this one person I was journeying for, and I was in this like crazy mad scientist lab, and I was talking with this mad scientist, and we were talking about like his plot to destroy the world, and like it ended up being this whole interesting aspect of self that had been totally disowned, that the client completely remembered 100% from their childhood, and the ways that they had loved to pretend to be this mad scientist and had all this like lab in their room that they had set up, but got shut down by the teachers in their life at that time. And so for me, I was like, I hope this makes sense. I don't know why we're here talking to this mad scientist, but I'm just going to go through it. And for them, it was this really important aspect of the journey. So it's my job just to be as detailed and specific as possible in what I'm sharing, and trust that if I'm in alignment with my sense of truth and what my helping spirits are showing with me, that is going to make sense to the people I'm sharing with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of symbol sets, the one thing that I wanted to talk about that does tie kind of, I suppose directly, you could say most easily to tarot, although it could be true of geomantic, symbols and runes and stuff like that, are the idea of archetypes, because you have a section in your book where you talk about archetypes, even though that's not really the primary focus, I would say. I mean, you talk about it somewhat, but that's kind of beyond the scope of that book. But I loved how you spoke about archetypes, because for myself, as a more polytheistically oriented witch, spirits, saints, gods are, they have their own form in some sense, and then there are more people that lean more towards the archetype side. But that nuanced discussion of, well, it usually turns into it's either or. Either you see the gods and saints as, archetypes, or they're, fully formed, beings, and there's certainly there's not like a middle ground or something that leaves room for both in the discussion, and you do talk about that in a really useful way. Can you just briefly describe for people what you see archetypes as? Because I feel like that's really helpful.
So first of all, I think that whole either or conversation comes out of a misunderstanding of Jung's work. Because of course, how we use the word archetype to describe these numinous forces comes out of, Carl Jung's work. So I think for some reason, and I haven't really done a great job of tracking the lineage of when this misinterpretation starts. But if you read Jung's original source material, like, for example, the Red Book, where he was really coming up with a lot of his theories, is going through his own initiatory crazy experience and doing his own inner work. Or if you read even Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious, which is a very widely available text, he specifically states that archetypes are not gods or myths or fairy tales, that those are already too colored by human consciousness. And archetypes are these numinous energies that are beyond the human. He calls them about them being like in the ultraviolet spectrum in his sort of languaging, but that they're found in all of life, in plants, in animals, in humanity, not just humanity. And so in my way of talking about archetypes, I think of them as this source code of the universe. And this, again, comes directly out of the teachings of my shamanic cosmology and the cycle of transformation. And this idea that archetypes are constantly trying to move through us into expression as they move throughout our day, because they're just the experience of us orienting to and being in service of life in the moment, of responding to what the moment is calling out of us, and being part of a conversation with the archetypal realms as we're all meant to be, just as part of our basic humanity, not as some like weird mystical spiritual thing, but just like that moment where you see someone in trouble across the street and you run to help them. That's warrior just coming through you in that moment, and you don't have to think about it. Or you're in that moment and suddenly you remember being bullied as a child and you feel terrified and paralyzed in fear and you can't act even though you want to help that person. So that's where our baggage or our triggers or all these inner parts of self that are stuck in these fearful moments get in the way of those archetypes being expressed fully through us. And so in that they are this source code of the universe, we can use them to repair our own source code, so to speak, and come back into relationship with our unique genius and the energy of life all around us, through calling them in, through dancing them, through making altars or shrines to them, through seeing how they show up in our inner landscape, what forms they take that teach us about our relationship with these archetypal energies, because that inner version of them is the embodiment of our relationship with that big cosmic energy. And so I also am a polytheist in some ways. I love, I have gods that I'm in deep relationship with. And for me, I think at the point we are in our culture, when we're so far off track, so to speak, when I say our culture, I'm really talking about actually humanity as a whole for the most part, except for some traditional peoples who have managed to maintain ways of being in the world that aren't in opposition to life and life on Earth surviving. That's what I mean when I say our culture. So the gods are so wrapped up in human protocol and human culture that they aren't always the best forces to help us to understand how do we begin again? How do we find a way forward as humanity that is actually in alignment with life itself versus just serving humans? And that's not to disparage gods in any way or say archetypes are some like better thing than the god. Some people love to suddenly become an evangelist of archetypes. Like, why are you working with God? That's so silly. Well, I work with archetypes. Like that's not what I'm talking about. Because in my way of looking, gods are just here. The world is full of gods, and so you don't tell a god when a god shows up in your room like, sorry, I only work with archetypes. Could you show up more broadly, less culturally specific, please? No, that's not how we work. And I think it's really useful to acknowledge the the presence of gods and love the gods that we want to love and the gods that are in our life, work with them skillfully and consciously, and understand that gods often have agendas that aren't always just to help you to live your purpose and do what you're here to do or be in alignment with life, that they can have all sorts of agendas wrapped up in them. And so to make sure as a conscious, active participant, is my agenda in alignment with this God's agenda? And if so, then yeah, let's work together. Let's explore. Let me be in relationship with this vast, numinous energy that's so much bigger than me, that can teach me, and our relationship can transform over time. But let me engage and enter in that relationship consciously, not just because they're a God. And I think, coming from a monotheistic standpoint, I should do what a God tells me to do,
Yeah. And it is that coming into relationships with all these different spirits and parts of ourselves that is a complex thing. And you speak a little bit towards the end of your book about how it is sometimes possible to be overwhelmed by this process, especially when you first see the full scope of it and you go, oh my goodness, there's so much to do. But at the same time, I love how you bring it back to the idea of it as a spiral, which is actually happens to be a part of our tradition, the tradition that I practice as well, because it is that constant flow of energy, that constant flow of learning about yourself and hopefully being in balance and right relation so that you can actually express yourself in a healthy way. But I think there's a beautiful part where you talk about it being a constant rebalancing. So it's not like I will now come to balance and that's it. I've done the work and now I'm a balanced person. End of story. Can you just speak a little bit about how, this is something that it's a constant journey with this?
Yeah. Well, so the deep liberation process described in the book is not meant to be some path of ascension where you become a star being that'd be fun, but that never has any problems again and never ever gets, pulled into the messy humanness of the world and just, skates through life completely.
I was going to use that as my selling point for you.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I know. I spoiled it.
Yes.
It's meant to be this process that, we have to understand that discomfort is sacred and part of the process, that discomfort is part of life. We become completely comfortable and have nothing left to explore or learn about our soul when we're dead. That's what hopefully when we're dead, if we have someone tending our death well and, we manage to die well, then hopefully we get to just become a loving ancestor. But as long as we're alive on this wild and crazy, beautiful, messy, fucked up, gorgeous earth, we have things to learn and things to explore, and there's more of our soul wanting to come into expression. And so these tools are not only for what you pathologize about yourself, what you think is wrong that needs to be fixed. They're a tool to continually stay in intimate relationship with life and be a conscious participant in life's attempts to initiate you into the truth that you came here to be and the fullness of who you came here to be. And so that's what these tools are meant for, is to help you to stay in that intimate relationship with yourself and your life. And I think, sorry, we can say something?
No, I was just agreeing.
Okay. Yeah. And so it's, it can feel overwhelming if you think, oh, I have to fix all of this now. I have to do all this work. But for me, this work is not something that ends. I will be engaging in this practice for the rest of my life. Not everyone has to do that necessarily or choose to do that. They might have other skills that work for them in a similar way. But for me, this is a practice I have committed to. And I have people that I meet with, on a weekly basis to help me to do this practice and hold space for me in doing it. Even as a person who's teaching and guiding many others in this practice. Because my life always has more to initiate me into, and so there's always, it's what I love about this practice too, is that it's not about just personal comfort. It's not about let me become more comfortable within this messed up culture. It's about how do I become powerful and resilient enough to be able to move into the fractures of our time and bring my unique medicine there of my purpose in a way that can begin to weave more wholeness within those fractures. And so that's my vision for the book, that people would be using these tools with each other in their communities, in spiritual communities, and whatever communities you're part of, and learning to show up for each other in staying in that relationship of growth and transformation, so we can create greater wholeness in this time where we're seeing so much fracture and so much division and so many lies and so much abuse of power. How do we become the people who don't wait for our culture to become perfect before we get to heal, but actually are able to weave healing within a broken culture?
Mm-hmm. And that through that act of healing, of working on our own inner transformation, then we can be better able to help our communities and actually do that work from a whole and a healthier place, rather than potentially trying to put band-aids on something or projecting outwards things that we just haven't dealt with within ourselves. Not that we're ever perfect and we wait until we're perfect to go out there in the world and do things, but that it has to be both. And that's how we actually change stories, as opposed to just recreating the same ones with a slight difference.
Exactly. Yeah, we write a new story for the people through living it with our lives. We live that new story, and then our lives become legend, and the people have a new story to live by. And it's so easy to create, in our world, it's, for some of us with certain, advantages, it's very easy to create a bubble of comfort, a bubble where everything's fine. I don't have any discomfort. I don't have any, issues with triggers or anything, because I'm in my bubble all the time, and so that's definitely not the end goal, but rather to be able to pierce that bubble and feel into how much we've been missing, how much we've sacrificed for the sake of the idea of perceived protection of that bubble, how many of the parts of ourself and our soul we've cut off to allow us to continue to exist in that bubble. So then we can actually see more clearly the current reality we're in and feel the love that's all around us available to us. And from that place of both feeling that current mess and feeling the love and the vision we're moving toward, begin to create something new with real traction, versus collapsing into the mess or collapsing into the vision. Like, I only deal with positive people, like, like that kind of thing. We need to cultivate a heart that can hold both. And I think we can only cultivate that capacity of heart through allowing our heart to break, and then engaging tools like this to heal the heart in a way that doesn't scar over and shrink, but actually becomes bigger and fuller and more strong and open, has a greater capacity to hold that structural tension between our vision and where we currently are, so we can move towards that vision.
Mm-hmm. That's beautifully spoken. I want to draw this to a close, even though we could talk for a lot longer, because I'm really, really enjoying this. So I thank you very, very much. But the question that I want to ask is, what would be any advice that you have for people in terms of helping to navigate their lives at this point in the timeline where we're at? Are there practices that you find doing every day or coming back to more frequently really help you with? I would say, people should very much, get your book and look at the practices that you have there. But is there something you want to share with people here?
That's a good question. Yeah. I do a lot of things every day. I'm definitely a daily practice junkie. But I think one thing I recommend people do is just take a moment to breathe, to connect to your breath, and you might consciously use your breath to move into your body. Maybe imagining sort of like a ball in the center of your head. You're breathing into like a ball of light, and breathing into your head, breathing into your heart, breathing into your belly, like these 3 centers of knowing. And breathing into your root, And from that place of really just feeling your root, taking a moment to ask yourself, what am I wanting in this moment? What am I desiring? And if you don't know, then feeling into, so when do I last remember feeling my desire, being in relation with my desire or my pleasure? And then can I do that thing the last time, whatever I was doing, the last time I remember feeling that, and begin to reforge that relationship? Because I think we're in a time where our pleasure and our desire is hijacked, constantly attacked on all sides by pornography, by social media, by pundits. Just everyone's like targeting our desire to manipulate it towards certain aims that often have to do with making money or profiting off of us. And so I want to just encourage people to take time each day to just take a few minutes to reconnect with your own desire and make sure that then you're finding some way in your day to take action based on that actual desire that's arising into your awareness.
Thank you. That is really, really beautiful. And I think that is a wonderful thing. So thank you for sharing that. And for the reminder, I'm thinking back to our Metaphysics of Desire workshop.
Yes.
Hearing you speak. So for people who want to get in touch with you, to know more about what you're doing, can you share, your website or what's the best way to follow you and know more about what you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm in transition right now on my website. Right now it's occupy-your-heart.com. Soon it will be langstonkahn.com in about a week or so. But for now, find me at occupy-your-heart.com. And you can also find me on Facebook. I have a Facebook. You can find me on Instagram at Occupy Your Heart. And which will also be changing to Langston Kahn. Actually, I'm just doing a big change right now. Mm-hmm. But yeah, those are the best ways to reach him. Really, you're welcome to email me or reach out through one of those platforms. I'm happy to talk with you.
Okay, that is really wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Langston, and thank you to everyone who submitted some questions and came tonight. And I will look forward to hopefully speaking to you another time. So thank you.
Oh yeah. And one last thing I forgot to say also, the book launch party for my book is going to be on January 19th. So people are interested in that, they can also check that out on my website or on social media. And yeah.
Okay, I will try to get the link and put that in the show notes so it'll be there for people who check this out when it first goes up.
Thanks.
Sorry if you're listening to it later, but
yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Langston.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Really good to talk with you.
All right. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
That was a conversation I had really been looking forward to, and we could easily have kept going for quite a while longer. Given how much is being thrown at all of us during these current times, learning and then remembering to really drop down into our bodies, into our deeper minds, is crucial now more than ever. The ability and the time to simply sit with and then feel what's really going on within ourselves, to feel and then also to allow, without immediately seeking to jump, to move, or change, is not something that's encouraged in our daily life these days. With the help of the practices Langston provides in his new book, it is certainly possible to develop those muscles of attention and feeling, and to then connect deeply with what we truly desire and what we truly know. Divination is about seeking knowledge in all forms, and I hope you'll check out Langston's work and his new book as you travel along your divinatory paths. I'll certainly be recommending it to coven mates and friends. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you to everyone who joined in live and submitted questions. Please subscribe to the podcast. Leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts if you enjoy what we're doing here. It really helps. And check out our website at coffeeanddivination.com. You can also find me on Twitter, where I am at FiddleAngel. Enjoy your journeys with divination, and I'll see you next time.